Okay, we're on air. Good morning, good day, good afternoon, a good part of day, I should say. Thank you all for joining the largest and the fastest growing and one of the most active LeSS communities globally. It's New York City, a large-scale Scrum group. We always try to keep you busy, engaged, entertained, and educated. Today we have our special speaker and presenter, Robin Hyman. He is from the UK. I'm not sure. Are you from London or from one of the suburbs elsewhere?
Originally London. Now I'm about 70 miles out.
Okay, cool. So just to give a few words about Robin. Robin is an agile coach with software engineering background who has served in many teams and organizations over the past 16 years. His mission is to help people succeed in figuring out better ways of working. He is known as a passionate and capable, pragmatic individual who builds strong working relationships and works hard to make difference for people he works with. Now, Robin was also in one of our past LeSS courses, and one of the things that he was very passionate about is how to address system modeling and system thinking aspect of large-scale Scrum, which we make a huge emphasis on, because in large-scale Scrum we want you to see the whole, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it, as we say it. So you end up owning your decision as opposed to renting from us. So I will say very little from here on. I'm going to pass the baton over to Robin. Once again, keep your cameras on, your mics off. He will run the show. He will engage you when needed, and so just stay engaged with us and use your chat room wisely. If you want to exchange, absolutely fine, but if you want a specific question for Robin, make it short, succinct, and supersede it with a prefix Q, colon, so that either he can pick it up quickly or I can and help him with parsing all of the content and giving to him. Okay, so anyway, passing on to you, Robin, and you have the capability of sharing the screen, right?
Yep.
Great. Okay, the floor is yours, guys. You're Robin.
Thanks. Right. Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. As Jean said, my name is Robin Hyman. I'm an agile coach. I work for a consultancy called BJSS. I work out of their London office. So yeah, as Jean said, we were recently, I joined a course that Jean was teaching, LeSS Basics, which I highly recommend, by the way. Jean's a great instructor. Part of that course, Jean taught us about causal loop diagrams. So yeah, there were a few of us who thought that those were pretty cool, and Jean thought it would be good for us and help us consolidate our learning and make us practice if we prepared a presentation for this meetup. So yeah, that's why I'm here. If I share my screen, so I've prepared a few slides. I just want to talk about really what I've learned. Obviously, it's just a few weeks. We did the course in December. We've had Christmas in between, so my practical experience is fairly limited. So please don't expect a masterclass in causal loop diagrams. This is a new student, just what I've learned in the last few weeks and what's been working for me so far. Let's get that screen shared. Okay. People got that? Should be a Miro board. All right. Okay. So, yeah, what I'm going to do is just take you through the basics. Just what is a causal loop diagram? Like I say, if you're already familiar with causal loop diagrams, there might not be much here for you. I'm hoping that for people who are new, they will get something useful from this. So it's just really going to go back to basics, what they are, how they're notated, different features and structures that you get in the diagrams, and basically some worked examples of of how I've worked through them. So, what are CODs for? Can you all read that? Okay, is that coming up big enough on the screen? Yep, I'll take that as a yes. Okay.
High quality.
Sorry.
High quality. Yep.
Yep.
Very
Good.
good. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah. So causal loop diagrams. They're basically representations of systems, and they're drawn as directed graphs. So they're sets of nodes and edges. The nodes are variables, things in the system that can change, and the edges are the relationships between those variables. The reason they're useful is to help us reason about systems. Because obviously they're a key systems thinking tool. So yeah, they help us to have build a mental model of the systems that we're interested in. And if we're working in groups with people, they help us to develop a shared mental model. They help us to visualize patterns and relationships between the different elements of a system. And they're also really useful as a coaching tool to help the coachees develop a kind of their own insights about the system and about cause and effect within the system. So rather than as a coach coming in, forming your own view and communicating that to teams, taking them through the process of building their own model and understanding all the different impacts and causes and effects, that helps them to have their own insight rather than something that's told them by a coach or a teacher. So I think they're quite a powerful coaching tool. I've also found them useful for having productive discussions. So keeping a discussion kind of focused on a topic and in a structured way, getting around that topic, also for generating activities, and what are we going to do? So it's helpful in deciding what to do about a given situation. As you see that in the picture there's people around a shared whiteboard, which is quite a common sort of use case for these. People develop them in groups together and produce a large diagram. So that's the artifact. The artifact itself, of course, has value. You can come back to it later, build on it some more, just use it as a reference point, something to help you facilitate discussions. But most of the value is in the conversation or in the thought process that you've gone through in building it yourself. So I'll take you through the basic notation. So I've just created a very noddy causal loop diagram here, which is, I've just kept it to variables so we can concentrate on the notations and not worry about the content too much. So here we've got a set of nodes, which I just use text for the nodes. I've seen other people use, put them in ellipsis or use sticky notes for them. But I just like the text, it's just nice and simple. So here we've got a very simple 3-variable causal loop diagram where variable A impacts variable B. You'll notice that relationship line is annotated with an O, not a 0, it's an O. It stands for opposite effect. So that means when variable A goes up, variable B will go down. Relationships that lack the O, that's just the default situation for me. That's a positive impact. So in this case, variable C, if that goes up, so will variable A. There are also another notation here, which is the double slash notation that indicates a time delay. So we'll see here variable B does impact variable C. It's a positive impact because it lacks the O. but there'll be some lag between, the action on, or the change in variable B and the change in variable C. Last thing really here is the thickness of the lines. That's used to indicate the strength of the relationship. So generally, I mean, you could just go A, B to C, but they're called causal loop diagrams. So quite often you will find that they loop back round. So something that is a cause is also affected by something else as well, and often there will be some kind of causal loop that takes you round back to a variable that impacted something. So in effect, a variable can impact itself. Moving on, so yeah, loops are an important feature of the diagrams. There are broadly two types of loops. One is called a balancing loop, and the other is a reinforcing loop. Balancing loops, you can think things like a thermostat, for example, very simple example. So in here, I've just drawn up a very simple model of that. We've got temperature. If temperature increases, this is an opposite effect here that we see. So that will reduce demand for heat. If demand for heat reduces, then so does heat output, and then so does temperature. And then in this case, because this is a balancing loop, now that temperature's reduced, it has the opposite effect, demand for heat. It increases demand for heat. So therefore, we increase heat output and temperature, and so on. So each time round the loop, it sort of flips the impact that the system has. So demand for heat will be toggling on and off. So these are useful. So just like a thermostat, they're in sort of a state or a type of system that maintains equilibrium. They can also limit growth in certain configurations. So if we think of a system like a population, we might think it will keep growing, but there might be balancing factors that, such as increase in likelihood of disease or a shortage of resources, that will try to balance out that natural tendency for growth. So yeah, systems like that, they're called balancing loops. The other type are reinforcing loops. I've done the most simple one I could think of here, which is just the cycle of violence. If we, violence leads to retaliation, which leads to violence, leads to retaliation, and so on. So they're very, very simple to understand. They reinforce growth or decay. Their basic quality is that they compound change in one direction. It's not necessarily bad things, reinforcing loops. There can be virtuous cycles as well as vicious cycles. We've got, so for example, positive reinforcement from a teacher can can motivate the student and give the student better outcomes, which in turn leads to more positive reinforcement and so on. So that's an example of a positive reinforcing loop. So they can be good or bad. So it's good to identify them when we model systems, because we can either try to suppress them if they're or dampen their effect if they're bad things, or alternatively we can exploit their effect if they're good things. So finally, this bit about on the theory side, so perspectives. So there's a guy called Peter Senge who's written a book called The Fifth Discipline, which is basically where I nicked this example from. This is the example he uses in the book about different perspectives on system and why it's good to get multiple perspectives when we create these diagrams. So he started with an example where from one perspective, so if you're a government, you might see terror attacks, logical, that impacts the sense of threat to the civilians, and that might build to a need for military response. And from one perspective, that's a totally valid perspective, and that's quite logical. And at a certain shallow level of reasoning, that's a perfectly rational situation. And that might be the level of discourse, say, in a tabloid press, or just a very superficial looking at the system. Of course, if you then get a different perspective, you might say that the military attacks lead to perceived aggressiveness. That might then, of course, build a sense of grievance and lead to there being more terror recruits. Which again, from that perspective, that seems like that's a rational position too. So what Senge did in his book is to say, well, okay, if we try and merge these and we say, okay, well, look, actually, a need for military response leads to more military attacks, and more terror recruits leads to more terror attacks. So we can combine these as one causal loop diagram. And from there, we can see we've got a loop. And this one, because it has no opposite effects that would toggle it and switch it on and off, this isn't a balancing loop, this is a reinforcing loop. So this one would be a something that we'd need to disrupt in some way. I mean, this is obviously a very simple and oversimplified representation here. I'm by no means suggesting that this is as simple as in here. This is just used for illustration, really, just to illustrate the point about perspectives. Okay, so I'll just take a pause there. Is there any questions so far? Does that all make sense about what they are and how they're used? Yep. Okay. Good. So, right, so I figured I would take you through what's worked for me in terms of how I've built them up.
Robin, quick question.
Yep.
This is not to anchor you to my views, but this is actually an excellent representation of a simple reinforcing loop. People may not be asking this question, but maybe it's somewhere in the back of their minds. If you wanted to change this, if you wanted to interfere, like, what would you do? I mean, from a standpoint of interacting in the most meaningful and the most powerful way. Maybe you don't want to use this arbitrary example. Maybe you want to use the actual practical example. Like, do you inject and maybe like turn the knob a little bit or turn it down so that the whole loop slows? I'm sorry. If you have it in the up your sleeve, just go on.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's fine. I mean, I'm thinking when I looked at this, I thought there's all sorts of other factors that could lead into it. It's obviously a very simplified. We might say, okay, what impact does profits from weapons sales have on the need for or desire for a military response? What impact does ideology have? Zealotry, religion. There's so many other factors here. You could build a very big diagram here and get into where you might make interventions to disrupt the reinforcing cycle.
That's what I meant. Yeah, thank you. Yep.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah, so I've tried various ways when I've tried building them. So the first way I encountered, or the first exercises I encountered in workshops were where we had a lot of variables on a page, and then we were trying to make meaningful connections between all those variables. So I found that approach overloading for me. I found it confusing a bit, and there was a bit kind of rabbit in the headlights, or analysis paralysis. Eventually, I thought I would try starting from just a single variable. What am I trying to achieve here? What's my system optimizing goal? So I started to just go from sort of conversations that I might have with a stakeholder at work while I'm coaching. So the thing that's immediately in mind is the sort of conversations I have. A manager might come to me concerned about their team productivity. So for me, I would start on a piece of paper, a blank sheet, team productivity. Right, what are the things that can impact that. So I found that if I just work around this one variable or one goal first of all, and go wide rather than deep first, that's just helped me with the way I think. That's just helped me to build models up. So quite often, if someone's come to you, the first step, if he says talking about team productivity, a manager might think it's some sort of deficiency with the team's knowledge and skills. So we get around the whiteboard and we draw that up on the board, and we draw a relationship between, okay, knowledge and skills has a positive impact. Increased knowledge and skills has a positive impact on team productivity. So as I said, we've got a choice here now. We could start going deep and say, okay, well, what impacts knowledge and skills? And then what impacts that thing from there on? But for me, I found it works better if I go wide first and then deep. So I would then probe. So I just keep saying what else and what else, and just try to drive out more things that are just focused on this goal. What other things impact team productivity? So we might say motivation, for example. And we might say that our hypothesis is increased motivation might lead to increased team productivity. We go, what else? And just keep going with the what else is, and we might come up with, I know, focus is a good thing. We might say that external dependencies might be hurting the team's ability to be productive. And just go around like that and just keep on going on there. We might say a level of rework. I'll stop at this one, so I won't bore you with just going through this, building it out. But yeah, we'll work out all the relationships. So these would all have positive relationships. We might say, yeah, knowledge and skills, motivation, focus, they're all good things that will influence team productivity in the way that we want. External dependencies and rework, they tend to harm the team's productivity. So these ones would have an opposite effect. So then I take those with an O. So yeah, so I go around and we start building this picture out, and then once we've gone round, we can start going out wider. Okay, knowledge and skills, what things can influence that? And we just work around, and we'll work systematically around all of these, just looking for impacts, looking for unintended impacts. What's useful is if these are expressed as nouns and not verbs, so they're things rather than actions, and hopefully things that we can measure and improve. I have found it depends how far you can get and how quickly this builds up, depends obviously on who you're working with, how deep the conversation is, how contentious some of the issues are. But I found it doesn't take long to build up to something about this sort of size. And I'd start, and again, a course as well. This all, it's going to be different with every group you work with. Different people will come up with different things. There's no right model, as it were. It's just the process of building the model together is helping us to develop some shared insights. And also, if you ask different groups, you will get different things. So perhaps if you're asking a manager who's hired, who just sees knowledge and skills as the core issue, if you brought some engineers into the conversation, you might find, oh, actually, distractions are really hurting us. We're going to too many meetings, and you might get different things to add to the model if you start bringing in other perspectives, as I showed you earlier. So yeah, I found that it's helpful to drive a structured conversation and take it necessarily a bit broader than maybe was first intended by the person who came to you. I've mostly done this in one-to-one so far myself. So it's just been a few weeks. I've gone through once with a team and it was good. We did have a productive conversation and we drove out a set of actions that were really good. So that's the one thing I liked about it, was we could come to this and we could say, okay, what are the things here? Which of these things can we change? What things are within our sphere of influence? Which of these things can we measure? Would these be good things? We can start looking for some loops. So in here, for example, we'll see there's a reinforcing loop here, going through productivity to micromanaging via motivation. That's got an even number of opposite effects. So it's not a balancing loop, it's a reinforcing loop. So that's a vicious cycle that we're going through. But there are a bunch of other ones of these taking different routes, going through, most of these routes going through micromanaging. I should add, by the way, it depends on the rapport you've got with the person you're working with, what terms you would use. I might not use the term micromanaging with everybody I'm working with, but if it's someone I'm friendly with, then and we can sort of tease each other about those things. But yeah, it just helps to see that there are other things we can do beyond improving the knowledge and skills with the team, and other levers we can pull, other dials we can dial up to try to make improvements. And we might understand that there are other drivers for these behaviors. So if we were going to try to disrupt this, for example, we might say, well, the micromanaging behavior is driven through a lack of productivity from the teams. So if we can get some quick wins there, that might reduce that impulse. It might be that he can't see what's going on in the team, so he needs constant updates. It might be other pressures outside of the team, so it might be his bosses or whatever. So I found it very good. Each of these things can be a kind of springboard to a further discussion. You could create another diagram around any of these, with any of these as the core focus. I've also found them useful.
Can I ask you a question?
Of course.
So I'm looking at this. How do you know where to? So you make these lovely diagrams. Now, how do you know where to start? What do you do to figure out where to begin when you finish these diagrams?
When you finish these diagrams.
Well, I mean, is there an end? I guess is what I'm trying to get to here, and what is this an input to? Because I'm trying to I get the intent of what you're doing. I'm trying to understand the next steps. Like, what am I going to do next with this, and how do we move forward with this?
Okay, yeah. So for me, the most useful way I've found so far is if we come out of the session with like a portfolio of actions or a set of experiments that we can do. So we'd been looking through these and working out which things we have the ability to change, and forming hypotheses about how we might change those things. And that gives us, we can start building a list of actions, and we can start prioritizing those actions based on the strengths of the relationships, or how many things does this thing impact. So we can say, okay, yeah, this looks quite a big one. There's lots of things leading to this. Motivation is quite a big one. So we build, in my head, it's a portfolio of experiments. It's a set of things that we can try and do and see, especially if they're measurable things, and especially if they're part of a loop, then they might have the opportunity to disrupt a reinforcing loop, or reduce the limiting growth impact of a balancing loop.
Robin, if I could quickly jump in, can I give 20-second idea to Barry as well?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure, please.
Yeah, Barry. So to your question, frankly, this may never end, or it may end whenever you find this useful enough to support your conversation. So think of what Robin has built as a small chunk of a very large ecosystem. You can keep building it out until you get to HR or to budgeting or to finance or some other areas of organizational dynamics, depending what problem you're trying to solve and what's your system optimizing goal, to have this conversation. Once you discover the system with your colleagues or peers, this could be like a very good throwaway, like it's useful waste. You have produced this diagram, you had a conversation, you had your realization. Now you can just toss it or put it out, someone, or make a note of it for future. So yeah, and how you start. So Robin starts in a very good way by dumping these variables on the canvas and trying to work with them. But you can start in one dimension and say, what does it take us? And you explore, and you have a conversation. So this is really meant to have a conversation with someone else, right? So I'm gonna.
If I can make an observation, what I'm seeing here is the idea of sitting down and looking at all the potentials before trying to solution. There's probably many organizations that would say automated test coverage is our biggest problem in team productivity. If we would automate, then we would get better. But the higher weighted line of work in progress and dependencies probably is a more indication of where we should start. And so by mapping out all the contributors first will help us to not solution too soon.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, but you see, I look at this and it reminds me of like an Ishikawa diagram or a fishbone diagram where I'd be doing something similar. I'm trying to understand sort of where, I mean, you have this idea of the opposite effect and things like that, which is interesting. I'm just trying to understand how I would actually use this in practice. That's why I'm asking the question.
I can try to share something too, if it may help. So I think one thing is like that there's no end state. If you think of something like team productivity, it's not a destination, it's a state, right? So you could go in and out of that state where team is productive or not, right? But going back to what Robin said around creating a hypothesis, right? Looking at it from let's just say training and coaching, we can say we can create a hypothesis. If we invest in training and coaching, our team productivity would increase. Or for instance, motivation. So you can create a bunch of hypotheses like this to pilot and test to validate if it has any effect on the team productivity. So it's in a way to collaborate and to create these hypotheses and to truly not pull things out of our, but actually validate it if it's having any impact or not. So I think if you look at, it's very similar to the traditional analysis approaches, but one of the issues with those is that it's a linear. It's assumption that you're getting to a root cause, where here you have multiple root causes that are continuously evolving. So I think that's how I see it.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yes, I mean, another use I've found personally as well is just literally in preparing for important conversations, just using it on my own. I've started to try and draw these things up just to make sure if I've got an important conversation with my boss or whoever, or a client, just to have helped me think through things a bit deeper and just get a better mental model of the thing that I want to talk about. But yeah, has your question been answered, Barry? Yep, good.
Thank you.
Yep, you're very welcome. So yeah, I mean, that's broadly, this is about as big as I've ever gone with them. I've seen them on the internet when I've searched huge ones. I find those, when I look at them, a bit overloading, but that's me coming in cold, looking at one that someone else has produced. I think, as I was saying earlier, a lot of the value is in going through the thought process of building it, rather than in the artifact itself. So yeah, and the things that have helped me beyond Gene's course, of course, is in particular this the Peter Senge book, Fifth Discipline. He talks a lot about systems thinking in there, and he introduces some of these ideas. He takes the idea of loops a bit further. So he talks about something called archetypes, what he calls archetypes, which are combinations of the loops. So it's where different loops interact with each other and have different effects on the system dynamics. So yeah, that was quite a very useful book. It's been recommended to me loads over the last few years as I've been meeting other coaches, and I finally got round to reading it, and it was indeed useful. So I wish I'd read it years ago. Also, of course, the LeSS site is full of loads of good stuff. There's loads of blog posts, articles. I've linked here to the Systems Thinking article, which is a good starting point. But yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff in there. If I do a Google search and just restrict it to less.works site, I come up with so many hits. A lot of my Google searches have taken me, I've ended up here at systemsthinker.com. Particularly, there's a page there that's got lots of guidelines for how to draw these, different kind of rules of thumb about the sort of qualities of the variables you choose and so on, and how to structure the diagrams. And then, of course, there is so much out there on Google. There's all sorts of stuff, and you can get lots of good examples. I've noticed there's some variation in notations. Some people use pluses and minuses instead of they use a minus symbol instead of an O for a minus effect. But it's all fairly intuitive and easy to understand. I think once you can understand one, you can understand more. And yeah, it's just a good starting point. There's just so many examples. And that is broadly where I've got to so far in my study of causal loop diagrams. I can definitely see myself using them a lot more as a coaching tool, and just personally in helping me to think through problems.
Yeah, Robin, before you open it up to questions, may I ask you, maybe you had this in mind. Would you want to maybe say a few words about how would you interfere with the system if you wanted to change it? Like, it's like almost, remember that analogy of hydraulics? You wanted to turn your cargo big time. What would you apply your force optimally? So in other words, maybe you want to use your example or just want to talk through it. Like,
okay, so yeah, so in my hand here, so say for example, one intervention we might find here, we've got a loop here going through goals, micromanaging, and we might say, okay, what's perceived as micromanaging is just an effort to understand what's going on. This is why I'll keep on in lots of updates and things like that. And we might find, okay, well, let's try an intervention here, seeing as that seems to be a route through lots of these loops. Let's try to speak, depending on, it depends on the character of the person, obviously, speaking with, let's get some interventions there. So we might have another conversation and go, well, visibility into what the teams are doing. Do they have good metrics and data? Can he see what's going on without constantly asking them? Would more transparency from the teams help the manager with that behavior? So that might be one. We might drill into, here we're finding that there's a lot of things leading into ability to focus. So we might try to say, perhaps if we limited work in progress, that might help. Which should reduce the amount of multitasking people have to do. We might find if we throttle back on shoving work into the system, we might help teams to be able to focus better, have a clearer sense of purpose, and that might just help them with the team productivity. Yes, there's a couple. I don't know if are there others that others would see in the group that might be beneficial. Anything jumps out at anyone? Or does that answer the sort of question you were asking, Gene?
Yeah, I think you were, yeah, I think you did.
I think the interventions, if they're in for something that's really something that's pivotal, then I think that then you get most bang for your buck. So if it's something that is seen on your diagram and that all the stakeholders agree is a big factor, then that would seem like a good target to go off. And we don't necessarily have to hit them directly. We can hit them obliquely, indirectly. And the visualization can help you to see where you can do that as well.
Yeah, I would interject also conversations. This will start a conversation as well.
Exactly. Yeah. I was going to say, is there like a lot of speculation? Like the whole point is to go back to hypothesis and validate these either. I mean, if you look at also kind of what happens outside of IT, there's a lot of simulation. Like, some of the things that you can do is actually use simulations to see and run some of your hypotheses. But the starting point here, the way that I've seen it, is just to have a conversation with people involved to really design how we're going to know that this is true. Because everything that Robin put on here is guessing, right? For most part.
It's people's perspectives. Yeah. It's not it's not a high fidelity true model of the system. It's people's mental model of it. But it just, as you say, it facilitates the conversation, and I think that's where a lot of the value is, and some of the actions there and the interventions will come from the conversations.
If I might contribute, Robin.
Of course, please.
I might have a very let's say strict view on the topic, but I don't think it's just. I didn't use it just for structuring or orienting or opening up conversations. That's not what causal loop diagrams are for. Causal loop diagrams are basic representations in forms of automata. So automata is plural. I don't know, I'm not a native speaker, but I guess automata is the plural. Just like in computer science when you define abstract machines. So it starts in systems thinking by defining the scope, the horizon of your environment you're going to look at, and the abstraction. So you have an underlying conceptual model. It's very different from any notation or diagram. That's not a diagram. It's not an Ishikawa or mind map. It's not a free thinking form. It's very disciplined. Why? Because you want to use it to structure your thoughts in terms of causalities. That's what it's used for, between particular concepts or items in your map of the world, be it studying customer behavior, be it studying your DevOps pipeline, the impact of your certain changes in the infrastructure on the performance of the team because your team just doesn't deal well with a lot of memory or they don't have the right tools, whatever. So you use it for analysis. So these analyses are not just, oh, where can I find an endless loop? No, you have an abstraction and you use them to ask questions such as, how many relationships do I have between this type of concept or this particular concepts and other instances of this type of concepts? For example, you can use it to study particular behavior in the enterprise, in your development team, using social network analysis. So your causal loop diagram would be people and a different color for different kinds of interactions between those people. Not looking at the frequency or the number of messages and what times it happens. Just, is it a hierarchical communication? Is it a help communication? Is it a execution communication? Is it a maintenance request? Whatever. And that's what you use to do all kinds of analysis. Why? Because it's focused on causalities, and that's what you use to ask all kinds of questions to the model. So you can have a causal loop diagram to think abstractly on what's going on in my model, but then you can have instances of it. So like if you want databases for particular companies or particular teams, and then see if what you expected from your behavior that you've seen on the model is really proven by the data you collected over, let's say, the course of 2 quarters or 12 sprints in your teams. So it's extremely powerful. For me, not comparable by no means to mind maps. Sorry for being so strict.
No, so at all. Thank you for that. I haven't got to that level yet with my study, but I will keep that in mind. I will try to see if I can use that as a deeper analysis tool. But so far, for me, the utility has been in the conversations. But yeah, it's early days with the study. But yeah, thanks for the steer. Cheers, much appreciated. Anyone else? Anything? Any observations or comments?
Okay. I think also just to add, like, it's a sense-making tool, right? So you can use everything that you said, Andrea. It's a sense-making tool, right? So it's a different, but it's really about making sense of reality. And if we have, here, at 35 people, we all might have slightly different ways that we see things. So getting together and doing something like this at least has proved, in my experience, to be very helpful. And then from there, try to see how we can influence the system. Like I think what was Gene alluding to earlier, to like, where would you focus on? If you see this, then what are the leverage points that you can push on to see how you can change the behavior of the system or the results that you're looking at?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Right. Okay. Well, if there's no other questions, I'll hand back to Gene. Thanks, guys, for your participation and for listening. Cheers. Back to you, Gene.
Well, thank you. And by the way, so Robin, I mean, we got 10 more minutes budgeted. We all took you into 50 minutes of the dialogue. Folks, I really want to, like, this is an open floor, right? So it doesn't have to be, so we can spend more time together for another 10 minutes or so. Do you have any specific questions for Robin? Maybe something?
I have a question, I guess. I was thinking about, Robin, you facilitated this variable by variable and kind of going through that. And I'm curious or wondering if you had predefined variables for conversations, just as a technique to, and the implications of that. Are we pushing them biased down a certain path by doing it that way? Or is, just kind of any thoughts on that for anybody on that?
I would try not to go with my own variables. I would try to do it. It's by asking the participants what else from from them. It's from their perspective to build a system. Yeah, I mean, I might have thought about it before and have my own ideas, but I wouldn't want to railroad it or put it in a certain way there. So it would be by asking the question rather than by suggesting things for me.
I have a confession to make, actually, Michael, to your question, Sir Robin just answered. In class, I'll take it's not a blame that I should take, it's just a confession. I anchor people. So when we run causal diagram exercises or events, obviously I can come up with a bunch of variables that are pre-cooked and I give it to the class. And I say, you guys figure out how to put them together. Of course, I'm anchoring them to those variables, but it's always I'm very explicit. If you don't think, oh, some of them belong here, toss them. If you think something is missing, add. Of course, it's based not just on a siloed thinking, it's based on my personal experience of working with others. So it's like there's some history behind why those variables are in place. But you're absolutely right. Ideally, when you engage in a dialogue like Milian, Robin, yourself, Mal, Ed, whoever, you guys want to come together and start with a, white page, right? With a whiteboard, maybe a few thoughts, dump them and start having a conversation. You want to have like what's called a system optimizing goal. Why are we doing this? What are we solving for? And when you go through this long loop, you may actually realize that the original system optimizing goal was incorrectly set. Like we, for example, can take a senior manager speaks at a town hall and makes a lot of emphasis on velocities. Look what's going to happen with the system when this takes place. How much dysfunction and emissions will be created. And then you realize, well, maybe that was not the right message to send. You see, so you're challenging your own initial assumption.
I have a question, sort of an insight here. If anyone has used it, have been using this for a while. When I see this, it's a lot to take in. And I feel like if I were to put it into a register where I list out, are these reinforcing or are they taking away or a negative? And then just go through and see what you have going on as an organization and just sort of document what is going on, what you can do, so that it sort of makes it more actionable for me. Has anyone used this where they listed out into a register and then started annotating where they are, what actions they're taking, so that they can track it in a more clear way, if you will?
Thank you for the question. It's an open question, guys. Anyone can jump in.
Yeah, not for me. I've not been using them very long, so certainly no formal register for me. we'll make a list as a team of things that we might want to target, but I haven't used it in a formal way like that myself.
Thanks.
Hey, Gene.
Yep.
Getting back to what you said about optimization, one of the things that these diagrams can do is start to detect where sub-optimization is going on in the system.
Yep.
Which can be equally valuable to people, right? And pointing that out to people can be challenging to do it in, I'm not going to say a respectful way, but to do it in a convincing way that, beatings don't improve morale. So even though we see them as something negative, some people's bias can see them as positive. That's the interesting thing about these diagrams is something I think is negative or oppositional to something. Somebody else could say, wait a minute, I see that as positive. So no matter what you do, you're going to introduce bias into your diagram. You might dilute the bias by having different perspectives, but you're still going to have bias in your diagram.
Absolutely. That's a very good point, Tom. Thank you. So cognitive bias is definitely a factor here. And while trying to optimize for the system, we oftentimes may discover that, hey, this is sub-optimization, as we refer to in lessons, local optimization. And we keep emphasizing this. And this is really not where we should be putting our effort and energy. This is trivial, almost, it has no value. So we should be maybe refocusing on something else.
Recently did, I think a couple of weeks ago, this in class, and one of the students did it on family happiness. So essentially, mom was happy when her daughter was home and not going to college, for instance, to live, but the daughter was actually happy when she was away from the home. And dad was there, also part of that family system. And it was really interesting how somebody took the family happiness and one perspective from a daughter versus mom versus dad, how it all contributed to the overall goal of happy families. So it was really fun to apply it in in that type of setting as well.
Oh, and Milian, thank you very much. And by the way, this brings another point to mind. Every time we talk about these models, right, whether it's in class or in real settings, they're very conditional, very circumstantial, and very situational. Like 5 people from this company may derive to a system model and discovery that is very different from the other company. Why? Well, because in this company, there's so much emphasis on bonuses and incentives and perks. And in that company, very little, because it's a very well paid base salary and maybe 0.111% of a bonus. So very different dynamics. So it's very conditional. So what works there may not necessarily work in the same exact way there.
For same people, like 5 months later, it might be completely different too.
And time factor. Tom, you were saying something?
Yeah, I was going to say, it goes back to the adage that all models are wrong, some are useful.
Some are useful, that's right.
Yeah, exactly. And I would definitely never dream of arriving to a group with my own model and then talking them through that. I think it's very important that it's co-created and that you're getting those the proper everybody's perspectives and not coloring it with your own as the coach.
Or at least validating, right? Even if you came up with a few discoveries in the morning, you want to take it back to your comrades and see if you can validate, if they can validate for you, right? Otherwise,
I would like to contribute something. I love the points about the bias, because for me that was the most important thing to know about all kinds of system thinking tools. But I remember in research, when I was a junior researcher in first years of my PhDs and my postdoc, my professor always forced me to simplify my models, and using various types of diagrams, CLDs was one of them, but to look for various causalities, he forced me to simplify them to the max and make choices, and having to accept that the models are de facto weak and biased because you have to focus on a certain point. And using them in workshops or with teams or with other people, you have, as a group, you are at least aware of where the tendencies, the trends of thinking go in the team, but at least you can have a discussion about whether or not people are focusing on the right thing in the system, and whether or not we should carve out some parts of the system and simplify our lives and focus on other parts and find or do some thinking or analysis on these other parts of the system later. And only then does the system open up, basically, and you dive into the causal loop diagram, and no data science or none of these fancy tools is needed. You can already start exploring and looking for evidence for certain correlations or even causalities, because most causalities are yet to be proven. When you get into discussion with the team, everybody states them as if they were certainties, but people find out very often that there are actually claims, and they deserve at least some discussion. And then somebody goes and pulls up some data, and in the next meeting they say, well, it turns out to be not the reason. We found out that it was linked to certain ends. The customers actually never mentioned that. We understood it that way. We entered it in a JIRA this way. What they wanted was this, and somehow we never heard them.
Yeah, that's important.
Thank you, Andrew.
Especially, I like the simplification point as well. I think I could benefit from that, because I found that it's easy to get them too messy and too cluttered. And I remember having the same problem when I first started doing UML when I was an engineer. It was tempting to try and get every single detail onto the diagram and just blind yourself with all this stuff. And the simplification was a very important step, to be conscious of what you're leaving out as much as what you're including.
That's why we say less is more. And, you know, we talk a lot in LeSS about sunk cost fallacy, right? When you have something big and expensive, you already paid for, you try to unpack and install it, and most likely going to use all of those complex, you know, bells and whistles. We'll be hesitant to simplify. Hey, folks, I realize that we're at the hour, and some people have dropped. I'm happy to keep the channel open if you would like to continue this dialogue, but also want to be cognizant of your time, especially if you're in early time zones, upstream from us, Easton.
Yeah, Gene, I had one question.
Yep.
Just to change the topic a little bit, a different focus in terms of LeSS, in terms of the adoption of LeSS and overutilization of component team structures. What do you see as a disadvantage or advantage of using too many component teams versus product teams? In my organization, they've built out tons of component teams, and we're getting just tons of optimization issues. And I'll let you speak to it.
Yeah, well, I'll be frank. This is a very, I can easily give you a very loaded answer. So the short answer is this: with system modeling, as a matter of fact, you can unpack so much with regards to feature teams versus component teams, right. System optimization versus global optimization. Right. And of course, in large scale Scrum, we make a huge emphasis on it. We want people to see and hear local optimization in team design, in product backlogs, in organizational relationships. So clearly, in LeSS, just like in Scrum, we want teams to be cross-functional, multifaceted individuals, also full-stack developers if possible, and aka feature teams. We don't even explicitly say feature teams, it's implied, because in Scrum and LeSS, teams work on features. Some of the omissions and challenges that we see with component team design, we unpack at large in those conversations. Causal loops is one of the great ways. So I don't want to steal from this conversation, because the conversation is just so big and so deep and so long. But if you want, I can share some content with you offline.
Thank you, sir.
But we're clearly, this is like one of the huge things, like LeSS is for product-centric, customer-centric, feature-centric development, and therefore component teams don't really do well in those settings. Anyway, I'll leave it at that for now.
Cool. I'm going to need to drop, Gene. I've made some family commitments.
Absolutely, Robin. So first of all, before you do, I want to express my personal thanks to you for coming out and doing this for all of us. This is a courageous act of stepping up and actually doing something. You are, like you mentioned, you don't have too much experience with this, but you clearly did really well. And some of your initial conceptualization away from Agile and LeSS was very useful, I think, at least to me.
Great, thank you. Well, yeah, I enjoyed it as well. It was useful for me, so I've picked a few things.
Yeah,
up as
that was my hope. So you will also get your few. So one kind ask, people haven't been asking me privately, could you please share some of those graphics? And I'm going to have the video I'm going to share with those that couldn't attend. And I'll have your personal contact info as well included with it. So if people want to reach out to you with questions, they can. Okay?
Cool, sure. I'll ping that to you after.
Absolutely.
Great. Yeah, thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Have the rest of the weekend to yourselves and enjoy it and have fun and be safe.
Cheers.
Don't do safe.
Thanks, Gene.
Thank you very much, Julia and everyone. Yeah. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye-bye.